Hello, everybody. My name is Sina Yazdanmehr from Infigo Information Security Company. I'm a penetration tester as well as information security consultant. In this presentation, I will talk about analyzing obfuscated JavaScript code. First, we will see. First, we will see what's the obfuscation. Then I will talk a bit about JavaScript features. Due to the time shortage, I won't be able to completely elaborate on this part. So just briefly explain some JavaScript abilities which are important, more important in obfuscation code. So I assume you know about concepts and basics, especially in JavaScript. Then I will focus more on obfuscation method, and finally, the obfuscation methods as well as tools. First, let's find obfuscation. Obfuscation as a word means obscuring, making a message harder to be read or understood. In computer sciences, especially in programming science, it means to disallow, not to allow reverse engineering and preventing agents unauthorized access to an application source code. Can say this technique is a two-edged sword. Why? Because it can bring us some benefits, but on the other hand, it has some disadvantages. Let's take a look at these simple JavaScript codes. Has a simple function which returns sum of two inputs and then an alert which pops a message on the screen and shows the result of that function. But if we make it obfuscated, we would have something like this code. Of course, we have lots of different methods in obfuscation. That is one of most common of them. As you can see, it's harder to be understood the obfuscated version. Now, let's start with advantages. First, since obfuscation makes it harder to be understood and be read by an attacker or maybe another person, so it takes more resources and time for code to be broken. First benefit is for business purposes. For example, when a developer or a company produces a new library or application, can do obfuscation in order to prevent unauthorized access to its source code. Of course, maybe for licensing implementations, maybe vendors use these obfuscation methods in order to prevent unauthorized usage of application. Obfuscation can help us with increasing security, since obfuscation makes it harder to analyzing the code. Maybe an attacker cannot find some vulnerabilities in your code. Of course, obfuscation can be implemented in two levels. In some programming language, interpretable programming language like JavaScript or, for example, Python, Perl, and etc. On code level, and on the other hand, for example, Java, C++, or for example, C can be implemented on the source code, clear source code, as well as on bytecodes. For example, in Android application, we have DexCar, which make Dex bytecodes obfuscated. But about disadvantages, as we saw earlier, the obfuscated version of our code is bigger than the killing size. So obfuscation at the first stage increases your code size. Of course, you cannot do anything with obfuscation. You're limited to the programming. For example, in Java, you're limited to the principle of Java. You cannot accept that. You cannot cross borders. Of course, you cannot obfuscate, for example, some keywords, like maybe var, for, while, something like that. Keywords are supposed to be clear in any programming language. Since we will see at the next part of presentation, we can obfuscate our code flow. So more complexity brings us more latency. Of course, this delay would be on the scale of some milliseconds. However, it might be some kind of issues in heavy applications and heavily obfuscated code. Since nowadays, obfuscation is a common method for bypassing, for example, antiviruses, WAFs, IDS, and some other security systems, usually antiviruses alerts when faces some suspicious or malicious obfuscated code. Maybe that code is clear and without any, for example, malicious part of code, but AV usually alerts when they receive such these codes. Please keep in mind, obfuscation makes it just harder, not impossible. Because if obfuscation could make it impossible, it wouldn't be interpreted by the compiler or interpreter of programming language. So maybe you make your code obfuscated, and attacker, based on your value of your code, decided to break it and spends, for example, lots of times and lots of resources, maybe money, in order to break that. It depends on your value of your application. We have another definition, minification. Unfortunately, these two methods usually get confused, and I have seen lots of articles which categorize minification as a obfuscation. What's the difference between these two techniques? That's our first example, simple JavaScript code. If we minify that, we would have something like this line of code. The purpose of minification is optimizing, zip up the code in order to make it faster and decrease the size, removing white space, remove it, for example, a blank line, shorten the function's name, and shrink, for example, variable's name. On the other hand, in obfuscation, we don't care about size, we don't care about latency. Our purpose is just make it uglier than clear version and make it harder and harder as it possible. Let's take a look at some JavaScript features, so briefly, which abilities are more important in obfuscation methods. First one, JavaScript is a dynamic and weak typing. What are those mean? Dynamic typing is referred to variables in the programming language. When a programming language is weak typed language, it means you can casting variables without any limitation. For example, in C programming language, you cannot convert integer type into the string type. But in JavaScript, you can do it easily without any limitation. You can define a variable and use it as a string, an integer, object, Boolean type, anything. Of course, you don't have to declare the variable first, initialize it first, and then use. You can use variables so freely. Beside of that, JavaScript is a weak typing, is a different definition. Let's explain it with a piece of Python code. Python is a strong typing in contrast of JavaScript. What does it mean? You cannot concatenate two different type of variable in a strong type programming language. For example, in Python, you cannot concatenate an integer and a string. The interpreter will raise an error, as you can see here. But in JavaScript, you can easily concatenate each type of variables with each other. For example, you can concatenate an integer with a string without any error. It simply means JavaScript don't care about data type safety. JavaScript supports first-class citizen. When you can pass, assign, or return a type or an object in your program, in your application, that type is called or is considered as a first-class citizen. This ability brings us some other features and ability. First, you can define your function as variables. For example, in JavaScript, without function keyword, you can assign a type, you can assign a new function to a variable and use it as a function in the rest of your code, as you can see in this example. Another feature is higher order functions. Higher order functions are those functions which return or accept other types as inputs. For example, in this example, we have two functions. In the first example, we have passed a new function, a new type, as an input to the previous function. And of course, you can declare your function first, then pass its definition as an input to other functions. With this ability, we have partial function application. What does it mean? As you can see, function add returns a new function as a result, as a return, and first function add, it requires A as an input. The returns of this function requires another input, which is called B. So you can use first-class citizen ability in order to pass, for example, in this example, 5 to the function B. The new instance of this function stored 5 as a first input. So at the rest of your code, you can use add 5 in order to add 5 to other numbers in this example. And you don't have to pass each time 5 as a first your input. Immediately invoked function, expression, or self-executing anonymous function is a particular feature for JavaScript. JavaScript just has this feature. This feature provides a lexical scope beside a global scope of application to the developer. Maybe developer needs to have a different scope for his variable, his functions during the runtime code. The most common pattern of immediately invoked function is using parentheses. If you define your function inside of pair of parentheses, and after that use another pair of parentheses, your function gets executed immediately after its definition. Of course, there are lots of other patterns for this feature. For example, you can use plus sign, negative sign, and other sign before the keyword of function. For example, the first example is used usually by Facebook in JavaScript codes. If you take a look at JavaScript codes of Facebook, you will see this type of immediately invoked function. Of course, if you use new keyword, which is usually used for get a new instance of object in OOP language, in JavaScript means execute the function immediately after its definition. In JavaScript, since it's usually used in client-side application, of course, JavaScript can be used in mobile application as a HTML5 application or on the other type of application or systems, but it usually used in client-side part of web application. So in a browser, JavaScript can access to other features of browser. For example, can interact with HTML, CSS, DOM tree, cookies, and other features. So if someone wants to obfuscate a JavaScript application manually, can hidden some part of code inside of other element of browser. For example, can cancel some part of data inside of DOM tree and access it from JavaScript by that features. Let's take a look at obfuscation methods. We can divide obfuscation methods in two major types: names, syntax, and data obfuscation, and on the other hand, data flow obfuscation. First example is name obfuscation. It helps with confusing the attacker to mix up. Why? If you use strange names, for example, in this example, variable's name and function's name cannot be easily be understood by attacker. If you use, for example, greeting name instead of that strange name, it would be so easier for someone to understand the code flow. Maybe obfuscator use same names, not completely same, but use similar characters in order to make it harder. For example, I, L, and 1 have the same shape. Or for example, O and 0 maybe use in order to make it harder and harder. Maybe obfuscator use the same name for variables and functions, but in the different scopes. For example, in a lexical scope, you would have a variable with name, like here, in global scope 2, and in object scope 2. So tracking such these variables and functions would be hard because you might mix up during analyzing this code. Other method is obfuscating data. The simplest one is encoding. For example, base64, URL encoding, ASCII encoding, and other type of encoding in order to just make it uglier and harder and time-consuming. Since JavaScript supports self-executing features, maybe in obfuscating process, you use anonymous function instead of a string. This function returns just alert and calls alert function from JavaScript contents. But at the first sight, it's not so clear to you. You have to analyze it and check it in order to find out the purpose of this function. Maybe obfuscator split, reverse, or manipulate somehow the string just for make it uglier. For example, here, the same as the previous example, calls just alert, but at the first sight, you cannot understand it. You should analyze it and track the code in order to find out the result of this join and reversing. Usually in obfuscating, we use a mathematical and bitwise operation just in order to add some large and big numbers to scare the attackers maybe. All this example just returns an alert, nothing else. A simple alert is generated by playing with mathematical bitwise in order to call different characters from context, join them, and finally execute an alert. On the other hand, which is, can say, more important things, code flow obfuscation. When you do refactoring in order to simplify syntax of an obfuscated code, after that, for understanding the code flow, you need to simplify code flow obfuscation. The most common tricks in code flow obfuscation is dead codes. Dead codes are part of codes which are executed, but the result of them are not important in the flow of code. A very common type is dead code switch statement, DSS. In this example, we have a simple while loop, and the result of this code, I, will be 101. Has a simple condition, simple loop just for 100 and returns I. But if we make it obfuscated, we would have something like that. Combination of switch, while, and if and else. So if you want to analyze this code, finally the result will be the same of the previous one, but it takes your time more and more. Let's analyze it. Case 1, just executed for first loop when the svar is equal to 1. After that, in these two cases, if you take a look and read it, working like if statement, just extended and using so much variables. So the loop is completely the same as previous with other statements. Another technique is data store, variables which are not used or is used but are not important in our code. Why? Because, for example, in our example, function variable x and I inside of function. The function uses them, but finally multiplies a and b and returns that value. So x and I are not important, just for confusing. Or in this example, can say they are the same. The final result of this function will be sum of a and b, but a void loop and storing the result multiple times inside of x, and finally returns the same result. Unreachable codes are those part of codes which never get executed. Dead codes get executed, but they aren't important. The result is not important. But unreachable codes won't get executed during the runtime. For example, in this example, we have some if statement and some DOM interaction. If we take a look deeper, inside of the for loop at the first if condition, this condition won't be true anymore. Does anyone know why? Can say it's completely false anytime. No? Okay, you can think about it because I don't have enough time to explain, but it's false always. So this part of code is unreachable, never get executed. In the body of else, we have another if condition, which is always 15. Again, does anyone know why this expression is written always 15? Of course, can say in entire of our life is always 15. Okay, this part of code is unreachable again. Finally, we have an if here, which be executed after 15 times because is an equivalent sign instead of upper sign. So finally, after 15th time of loop, this function returns window objects. And other parts, those variables and var n is data store and are not useful, just returning object, window object. Other tip is conditions obfuscation. We have maybe always false, which means unreachable codes, and maybe have always true, which means void condition. For example, in this example, we have an if. The condition is this part. We have empty string with a replace. Replace is dead code because replace a string with a string, replacing the same data type. So there is no change after this replacement. And we cast it to the Boolean and make it vice versa. So Boolean with empty input is always false, with a string is true, and empty string is false. So finally, the result of this condition is always true. Just you need to take more time in order to analyze it and find out that's a junk if here. Non-alphanumeric type is can say not common type because of some disadvantages. For example, alert hellos in this type would be a bunch of punctuation signs. Because of limitation in character range, the size of code will be so huge, so it's not reasonable to use this type of obfuscation. On the other hand, since it's not normal and just use some punctuation codes, it's usually catched by antiviruses and cause them to raise an alert. But it has an advantage. You can even obfuscate keywords and inside them in an eval function and again obfuscate that eval function. So if we want to take a brief look at this type, we can make an array with pair of square. We can cast it to the boolean. We can cast it to the number, and an empty array is equal to 0. Then, if we sum it with an empty string, we will cast it to the string. So, easily we can make a type of false, then concatenate it with an empty string, and finally we will have a string with which its value is false. So we have F, A, L, S, and E characters. Then, if we use brackets sign in order to just extract the index 1, we will have A character. At the next step, with number 5 and 6, we can substitute false with the expression in number 5. So now we have 1 and we have to obfuscate it again. As a result of number 2 and 3, we can make true, type true, then change it to the number, which is equivalent to 1, and then casting to the number again. So the final result will be this expression, bunch of punctuation codes, which is equivalent to the A. So if we want to use this approach, we need to build each character one by one. So that's the reason why this method is not so useful. It's really good to know common type of obfuscation method in JavaScript. We have some scripts, some online websites, which do obfuscation with a fixed pattern. The result will be the same. If you know them, when you are gonna deobfuscate a JavaScript code, they can help you because you know them and can easily deobfuscate them. For deobfuscating, the first step would be preprint in order to make it a bit better and nicer to be understood. Then start to refactor names, functions name, variables name, and data. Refactoring means deobfuscating the syntax and data. After that, I start to simplify the code flow. For this stage, check conditions and try to ease them. Then remove dead and unreachable code because they aren't important in your code. Just make your code uglier. Then lighten the loops. As we saw, loops can be abused in order to make the code more and more. Then reduce any complexities in each part of code, in each condition. And try to recognize common type. So if you know the common types, you know the obfuscation approach, and you won't spend more time on that. For tools for the obfuscating, you need a powerful IDE. Atom, brackets, and lightable are approximately, can say, they are the same about the structure, about the features and abilities. I would rather use Atom. I will say what. Sublime text is a good option too, as well as you can use other IDEs which suits you. For example, you can use Eclipse, NetBeans, and etc. For analyzing, you would need a debugger. For example, you can use Firebug, Chrome Developer Tools, or JavaScript debugger directly. For example, you can use V8 debugger, Node debugger, or etc. I would rather to use Firebug, but if you want to use Chrome, Google Developer Tools is a real powerful tool for this manner. Atom provides you pre-print to nature without any package. You can just click right and pre-print it. Eval selection for analyzing code follow. You can just select that part of code and execute it in a different context. It provides a refactoring package. For example, for refactoring names and data, you select the variable names, rename that, and the variable name gets renamed in whole of your code. You can run a script in a different context, whole script in a different context of your browser, because if you want to analyzing malicious JavaScript code, it's not, it doesn't make sense to run it directly in your own browser. Firebug. It has some advantages. For example, highlight change. If JavaScript or any other elements make a change in your DOM tree or in your HTML code, automatically get highlighted by Firebug. You can monitor your network communication in each type, for example, WebSocket communication, AJAX, or other type of communication. You have DOM exploration. You can easily explore your DOM tree functions and variables. On the other hand, a Firebug debugger is so powerful, provide you two kind of breakpoints, simple breakpoints. You 100% know what's breakpoints, so I pass up this. Conditional breakpoints means the JavaScript code will be stopped at a certain condition. You define a condition and debugger stops the code if the condition is true. You can trace your code step by step after stopping the code by debugger. You will have a stack trace. Firebug shows you the stack, call stack of code till a stopping point. You can set watch expression and use variable tooltips. Watch expression, you can monitor a special variable or DOM nodes during your execution code, or you can just pull your mouse pointer on a variable and see the decoded value of that variable. You can look function calls and a specific function. You can log it and monitor it, or profile all functions log. So at the end of execution, you would have a log which shows you how many times which function is called. Of course, you will have some functions. If you don't know the start point of a function, you just pass the name of function to the debug function, and it will automatically set a breakpoint at the first line of that function. Monitor is approximately the same as debug function. You pass the name of function to that and automatically set logging for that function. At the end, get event listener. Since event listeners are important in DOM tree and some event is assigned to a specific DOM node, you can get a list of event listeners by this function and just pass the DOM node name to this. I'm so sorry for speed up my talks at the end because of time shortage. So is there any question? Yeah. Sorry.
Correct me if I'm wrong, if I understand this correctly. We want to have properly obfuscated code. This is something we have to think about during the design and the development. You cannot rely on automatic tools and means.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, in order to have a secure code, we have to abandon all of proper function execution, encapsulation, all of that stuff, and practically go back to programming languages that use go-to comments instead of loops in order to have it really obfuscated. Does that mean then that by obfuscating and applying those principles, we are making our code much more difficult to maintain, and then in the future more error-prone during maintenance?
Okay, when you develop a code, as I said at the first slide, you are limited. You are limited for some principle and programming language limitation. But when you develop a code and want to release that at the final stage, you will release obfuscated version of your code. You don't have to remove your clear code and just keep the obfuscated version. On the other hand, if you use automated tools, yeah, at each time you will give a same pattern at the previous one. If you want to do it manually, you should spend more time, spend more resources in order to obfuscate your code part by part. So, depends on your code's value, it depends on you. If you want to spend time and, for example, resources in order to make your code obfuscated or not. But automated tools are not so powerful. Just a simple layer of obfuscation which can be deobfuscated easily maybe by other type of automated deobfuscation tools. Other question maybe? Okay, thank you for attention.